In 1945, a country lay in ashes. Two of its cities had been erased by weapons that no one fully understood yet. Its navy was at the bottom of the Pacific. Its army, which had once marched through China and Southeast Asia with terrifying confidence, was gone. And its emperor, a man his people had been taught since birth to regard as a living god, stepped in front of a microphone for the first time in his life and told them they had lost. Not just the war, everything. The soldiers who had been trained to die before surrendering now had to figure out how to live in a country that no longer knew what it was. The cities that had been firebombed into rubble had to be rebuilt by people who had nothing. The identity of an entire civilization, built over more than 1,000 years, had to be reassembled from the wreckage of a single catastrophic decade. And then, 40 years later, Japan was the second largest economy on Earth. Here is the question that history keeps skipping over. This was not the first time Japan had done this. A century earlier, it had looked at its own political system, a system that had governed it for nearly 700 years, and decided to dismantle it, deliberately, strategically, in less than a decade, and rebuild it into something entirely different. 2 collapses, 2 rebuilds, each one producing a version of Japan more capable in crucial ways than the one before it. How does a civilization learn to collapse forward? That is not a simple question, and it does not have a simple answer. But if you follow Japan from the very beginning, from the first people who crossed into these islands before anyone called them Japanese, through the samurai who ruled for centuries and the emperors who outlasted everyone, through the wars that shattered everything and the recoveries that stunned the world, a pattern starts to emerge. Japan does not survive by accident. It survives by paying attention to its own failures, to the world around it, and to the specific moment when the old system has to die so something better can take its place. This is the entire history of Japan. Chapter 1. Before the islands, the world Japan was born into. Picture the Japanese archipelago from above, the way a satellite might see it today. 4 main islands and nearly 7,000 smaller ones, arranged in a long curved chain along the eastern edge of the Asian continent. To the west, across a stretch of water that varies between 100 and 200 kilometers at its narrowest points, lies the Korean Peninsula. Beyond that, China. To the east, nothing but the Pacific Ocean for thousands of kilometers until you reach the coast of North America. This geography is not a backdrop to Japanese history. It is the first and most persistent fact of Japanese history. Everything that follows, the way Japan absorbed foreign ideas, the way it defended itself, the way it closed its borders for 250 years and then opened them in a single decade, flows directly from this geographic reality. Japan is close enough to Asia to receive every major cultural, religious, and technological development that moved through the continent, and it is far enough away that it could choose what to accept and what to refuse. That combination, proximity and distance, access and insulation, is something almost no other major civilization in human history has enjoyed in quite the same way. And Japan used it with a consistency that, once you see it, is impossible to unsee. But before Japan could use its geography, it had to be populated. And that story begins much earlier than most people expect. The earliest evidence of human presence in the Japanese archipelago dates to somewhere around 30,000 years before the present, during a period when sea levels were significantly lower than they are today, and land bridges connected parts of the islands to the Asian mainland. The people who arrived during this period left behind stone tools, but very little else that survives in the archaeological record with enough clarity to draw firm conclusions about their social organization or their numbers. What does survive in abundance? Beginning roughly around 14,000 years before the present, is pottery. This matters more than it might initially seem. The ceramic tradition associated with Japan's earliest identifiable culture, which archaeologists call the Jōmon, produces some of the oldest fired pottery yet discovered anywhere on Earth. The Jōmon people were not farmers. They were hunter-gatherers and fishers, living in small communities along coastlines and river valleys. Exploiting the extraordinary ecological richness of the Japanese islands with a sophistication that their material culture makes unmistakably clear. The fact that they were producing complex, decorated pottery at a time when agriculture had not yet reached the archipelago suggests a level of settled, stable community life that archaeologists once assumed required farming to sustain. The Jōmon period lasted for an extraordinary span of time, roughly from 14,000 to 300 BCE, a duration that dwarfs every subsequent period in Japanese history combined. During those thousands of years, the people of the archipelago developed regional traditions, ritual practices centered on clay figurines called dagu, whose meaning remains actively debated among specialists, and a relationship with the land and sea that was intimate, sustainable, and deeply localized. Then, roughly 2,300 years ago, everything changed. The people archaeologists call the Yayoi began arriving in the archipelago, most likely from the Korean peninsula and possibly from parts of coastal China, bringing with them something the Jōmon had never had: wet rice agriculture. The Yayoi also brought bronze and iron technology, weaving techniques, and a social organization structured around settled agricultural villages rather than the mobile patterns of hunter-gatherer life. The encounter between the Jōmon and the Yayoi was not a simple replacement. Modern genetic analysis, including research published by teams at the National Museum of Nature and Science in Japan, indicates that contemporary Japanese people carry ancestry from both populations, with the proportions varying by region. The Ainu people of northern Hokkaido, who maintained a distinct cultural identity well into the modern period, and who are recognized today as an indigenous people of Japan, show substantially higher proportions of Jōmon-related ancestry than populations in central and southern Honshu, suggesting that the mixing of these two founding populations was geographically uneven and played out over centuries rather than decades. What the Yayoi brought was not just technology. It was a new way of organizing human communities around the collective labor that wet rice cultivation requires. Rice paddies demand coordination. They demand shared water management systems. They demand the kind of sustained communal effort that produces, over time, hierarchy, specialization, and eventually the beginnings of political organization. By roughly the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, Chinese historical records, specifically the document known as the Weiji, are describing a place called Wa, identifiable as Japan, in terms that indicate recognizable political structures. The Weiji describes a land of more than 100 communities, some of which had submitted to a paramount ruler. It describes the leader of the most powerful of these communities as a woman named Himiko, who governed through religious authority as much as political power, who lived in seclusion, surrounded by 1,000 female attendants, and whose death around 248 CE reportedly triggered a conflict over succession that killed more than 1,000 people. Himiko is a figure who sits precisely at the boundary between history and legend in the Japanese tradition, which did not produce its own written records until several centuries after her death. The Chinese account is the primary source for her existence, and scholars, including Gina Barnes, whose work on Japanese prehistory represents one of the most systematic archaeological treatments available in English, treat the Meiji descriptions with careful source criticism, neither dismissing them entirely nor accepting them as straightforward historical documentation. What Himiko represents, whatever the precise historical reality behind the Chinese account, is a recognizable threshold. Japan was no longer a collection of isolated communities. It was a political landscape, contested and hierarchical, where authority was real and succession was worth killing over. The islands had been populated for 30,000 years. The agricultural revolution had reorganized their social life for 2,000. And now, somewhere in the forested hills of western Honshu or northern Kyushu, the thing that would eventually become the Japanese state was beginning to take shape. It would take several more centuries to fully emerge. But the conditions were in place. The geography was fixed. The population was established. The agricultural surplus that makes civilization possible was being produced. And somewhere in the inheritance of all those thousands of years of Jōmon and Yayoi life, a set of instincts was forming that would prove remarkably durable. The instinct to observe before acting. The instinct to absorb what is useful from the outside world without being consumed by it. The instinct to find, in the specific constraints of island life, not limitation, but a kind of creative pressure. Japan had not yet invented itself, but the raw materials were all there, shaped by an island geography that would keep rewarding the same set of capabilities for the next 2,000 years. The world was about to offer Japan its first great test. A civilization of extraordinary power and sophistication lay just across the water to the west, and it was impossible to ignore. Chapter 2. The God Emperor and the Borrowed Civilization. There is a moment in the history of every civilization when it looks at a neighbor and makes a decision that will define it for centuries. For Japan, that moment came sometime in the 5th and 6th centuries of the Common Era, when the archipelago turned its attention westward across the Korea Strait and confronted a civilization that was, by any measurable standard of the time, more advanced. China, under the Han and then the Tang dynasties, had a written language, a sophisticated legal code, a bureaucratic system capable of administering millions of people, a philosophical tradition stretching back centuries, and an architectural grandeur that made everything in the Japanese islands look provisional by comparison. A lesser civilization might have been overwhelmed. A more defensively proud one might have looked away. Japan did something that, in the context of world history, is genuinely rare. It decided to learn, not selectively, not grudgingly, but with a systematic intentionality that amounted to one of the most ambitious, voluntary cultural transformations in pre-modern history. But to understand what Japan chose to import, you first have to understand what it was starting from. By the time serious contact with the continent intensified in the 5th century, the political landscape of the Japanese archipelago had consolidated around a dominant clan called the Yamato, based in the fertile basin of what is now the Nara and Osaka region of central Honshu. The Yamato rulers were not yet emperors in any bureaucratic sense. Their authority rested on a combination of military power, control of agricultural land, and their role as the chief ritual performers of a religious tradition that modern scholars call Shinto. though that name and the formalized religious system it describes came later. Shinto, in its earliest form, was not a theology with doctrines and texts. It was a set of practices and sensibilities oriented around the recognition of sacred power, called kami, in natural phenomena, mountains, rivers, storms, unusual rocks, ancient trees, the processes of birth and death and agricultural cycle. All of these could be inhabited by kami, whose goodwill had to be cultivated and whose displeasure had to be averted through ritual. The Yamato rulers claimed descent from Amaterasu, the sun goddess who occupied the apex of this system, and that claim gave them a religious authority that was inseparable from their political authority. This fusion of divine descent and political power created something that would prove one of the most durable institutions in human history. The imperial line, the Yamato dynasty, in its direct and collateral branches, has remained on the Japanese throne from that early period to the present day, widely regarded as the longest continuously reigning royal house in recorded history. That longevity was not accidental, and understanding how it survived everything that came after, shogunates and civil wars and foreign occupation and devastation, requires understanding how it was constructed in the first place. The Yamato rulers were not all-powerful in the way that the Chinese Son of Heaven was conceived to be. Their authority was more ritualistic than administrative. Real power, military and economic, was shared with and often controlled by a network of great clans. The Yuji, whose cooperation the Yamato needed and whose rivalry was a permanent source of instability. It was precisely this instability, and the Yamato court's search for tools to manage it, that made the civilization across the water so attractive. Buddhism arrived in Japan in the mid-6th century. The traditional date given in Japanese chronicles is 552 CE, though some scholars prefer 538. And the historian William Wayne Ferris, in his detailed examination of early Japanese history, notes that the precise date matters less than the manner of arrival. Buddhism did not come to Japan as a foreign invasion or a missionary project. It came as a diplomatic gift, transmitted through the Korean kingdom of Baekje as part of a political relationship. Wrapped in the regalia of a sophisticated continental civilization, sutras and a statue of the Buddha arrived at the Yamato court as tokens of prestige. What followed was not a simple religious conversion. It was a political struggle. The Soga clan, one of the most powerful at the Yamato court, recognized immediately that Buddhism and the broader package of continental culture it represented offered something invaluable, a set of administrative, legal, and philosophical tools that could help rationalize and centralize political authority. Their rivals, the Mononobe and Nakatomi clans, understood the same thing and opposed it for exactly the same reason. The conflict between these factions was not really about theology. It was about who would control the process of transformation, and therefore, who would benefit most from it. The Soga won, and their victory cleared the path for the figure who, more than anyone else, shaped Japan's first great leap of cultural borrowing, Prince Shotoku, who served as regent for his aunt Empress Suiko from 593 CE until his death in 622. Is one of the most carefully constructed figures in Japanese historical memory. The chronicles, compiled more than a century after his death, credit him with an almost superhuman range of accomplishments. And historians, including Joan Pigott, whose work on early Japanese state formation is among the most rigorous available, Note that many achievements attributed to Shotoku likely reflect the work of the court and its institutions over several decades rather than a single man. What the tradition encodes, beneath its hagiographic layers, is real. A period of deliberate, systematic, and transformative engagement with continental civilization. Under the influence of Shotoku and the broader court movement he represented, the Yamato government dispatched formal missions to Sui dynasty China, establishing sustained diplomatic relations for the first time. These missions were not simply trading expeditions. They were educational ones. Japanese students, monks, and officials traveled to the continent, spent years studying Chinese law, philosophy, Buddhism, medicine, astronomy, and administration, and returned home carrying everything they had learned. The document, known as the 17-Article Constitution, traditionally attributed to Shotoku and dated to 604 CE, is not a constitution in the modern sense. It is a moral and administrative guide for court officials, drawing heavily on Confucian and Buddhist principles to articulate a vision of governance centered on harmony, hierarchy, and the subordination of private interest to public good. The opening principle, that harmony is to be valued and contention avoided, encoded a political philosophy that would resonate through Japanese governance for more than a millennium. The Taika reform of 645 CE pushed the process further. Land was to be nationalized. A census was to be conducted. A system of provinces and districts was to replace the clan-based territorial organization. The legal codes that followed, the Taiho Code of 701 CE and the Yoro Code of 718, represent the most systematic attempt yet to impose a Chinese-style administrative state on Japanese conditions. The historian Karl F, whose work on early Japanese military institutions illuminates how far reality often diverged from the legal ideal, notes that the gap between the codes as written and the codes as actually enforced was substantial from the beginning. But the direction was unmistakable. Japan was building, in the course of roughly a century and a half, a literate bureaucratic state, a monumental capital city, a state-sponsored religious institution, and a written historical tradition. None of these things had existed in the archipelago at the start of the 6th century. The new capital at Nara, completed in 710 CE and modeled directly on the Tang dynasty capital of Chang'an, announced the transformation in architectural terms, a grid city of straight avenues and symmetrical precincts, with the imperial palace at its northern axis and Buddhist temples of extraordinary scale distributed through its grid. Nara was a physical statement that Japan had absorbed one of the greatest urban traditions in Asia and made it its own. The Todaiji Temple Complex, completed in 752 CE under Emperor Shomu, contains a hall long counted among the largest wooden structures in the world. The Great Buddha Hall houses a bronze statue of the Buddha Vairocana that stands nearly 15 meters tall and required, according to estimates from the temple's own historical records, the labor of more than 2 million people to complete. Emperor Shomu understood something that builders of great monuments in every civilization have understood. The act of building something that seems impossible is itself a political statement. It tells every person who participates in its construction and every person who looks at it afterward that the authority which organized that effort is real, powerful, and worthy of loyalty. Here is the deeper point the temple makes, though one that goes beyond imperial propaganda. Japan had arrived at this moment with nothing. In cultural terms, less than 2 centuries earlier, no writing, no monumental architecture, no bureaucratic administration, and now it had built one of the largest wooden structures on Earth. The speed of that transformation is remarkable by any historical standard, and it was achieved not by accident or by conquest, but by deliberate cultural learning of a kind that few civilizations have managed with the same consistency. But learning from China did not mean becoming China. This is the point that separates Japan's cultural borrowing from simple imitation, and it is the point that matters most for understanding everything that came after. The Japanese took the Chinese writing system and adapted it to a language grammatically almost entirely unlike Chinese, developing phonetic scripts called hiragana and katakana that allowed them to write their own language in their own way. They took Chinese Buddhism and gradually blended it with indigenous Shinto sensibilities to produce religious forms that were distinctly Japanese. They took the Chinese model of the emperor as absolute ruler and quietly retained the reality of power sharing with great clans, producing a system where the emperor's symbolic authority was unquestioned, even when his practical authority was minimal. In each case, the form was borrowed and the content was transformed. The container was Chinese. What went inside it was Japanese. This capacity to absorb the best of what the outside world offers without being absorbed by it is the first signature move of Japanese civilization. It will appear again in the 19th century and again in the 20th, each time in response to a world that has changed faster than the old system can manage. In the 8th century, Japan was still learning how to use it, and the society being built in the shadow of those great Buddhist temples was about to produce something that nobody, looking at the transplanted Chinese model, could have predicted: a culture of extraordinary refinement, sensibility, and literary achievement, developed not by soldiers or priests, but by courtiers writing poetry in a new script, in a new capital, in a world that was becoming unmistakably, irreducibly Japanese. Chapter 3. The Age of the Aristocrats, when Poetry was Power. In the year 794 CE, the Japanese court moved its capital from Nara to a new city called Heian-kyo, capital of peace and tranquility, located in what is now Kyoto. The official reasons given for the move were practical. Nara had become dominated by Buddhist institutions, whose political influence the court wanted to escape. The new site offered better geomantic positioning. According to the Chinese cosmological principles, the court still consulted for major decisions. But what actually happened in Heian-kyo over the next 4 centuries was something that no geomantic calculation could have predicted. Japan stopped looking westward. It turned inward. And in that turning inward, it produced one of the most remarkable artistic and literary cultures in human history. The Heian period, which historians date from 794 to 1185 CE, is in many ways the most misunderstood era in Japanese history. It is often described as a period of aristocratic decadence, of courtiers too absorbed in the color of their robes and the quality of their calligraphy to notice that the political foundations of their world were rotting beneath them. That description is not entirely wrong, but it misses what was actually being created in those elegant rooms and perfumed gardens, and why it matters not just for Japan, but for the history of human expression. To understand Heian culture, you have to understand who was living in it. The city of Heian-kyo, at its height, housed perhaps 100,000 people. The court aristocracy who defined its cultural life numbered only in the hundreds. These were men and women of the Fujiwara clan, and a handful of related families who occupied the senior ranks of court society, whose lives were governed by an elaborate system of rank, ceremony, and aesthetic expectations so refined that a person's worth was judged as much by the quality of their poetry as by their political connections. This was not superficiality. It was a system of social communication as complex and demanding as any in the world. At the Heian court, poetry was the medium through which relationships were initiated, maintained, and expressed. A man who wished to court a woman composed a poem on a specific theme, matched to the season and the emotional register of the moment, written on paper of a color chosen for its associative resonance, tied to a branch selected for its seasonal meaning, and delivered before dawn. The woman's response poem, composed with equal care, communicated not just her feelings, but her intelligence, her learning, her aesthetic sensibility. A clumsy poem was a social disaster. An inspired one could transform a life. This is the world that produced what many literary historians often describe as one of the world's earliest great novels, The Tale of Genji, composed by Murasaki Shikibu sometime around the year 1000 CE. Is a work of such psychological complexity and narrative sophistication that readers encountering it for the first time in modern translation are frequently startled to find something that feels, despite its 11th century setting, recognizably novelistic. Its protagonist, the shining Prince Genji, is not a hero in any conventional sense. He is a man of extraordinary gifts and deep flaws, whose relationships with women trace not a story of triumph, but an extended meditation on impermanence, longing, and the elusiveness of beauty. The scholar Ivan Morris, in his foundational study of Heian culture titled The World of the Shining Prince, published in 1964, describes Murasaki Shikibu's achievement as the creation of a form of psychological realism that would not appear in Western literature for several more centuries. The historian Donald Keene, whose multi-volume history of Japanese literature remains the most comprehensive treatment in English, is careful to note that the tale of Genji operates within aesthetic assumptions quite different from those of the European novel tradition. But the core observation stands. A woman at a court in 11th century Kyoto produced a work of sustained narrative imagination that has never been out of print in 1,000 years. Murasaki Shikibu was not alone. Sei Shonagon, a contemporary lady-in-waiting, whose pillow book remains one of the most entertaining and psychologically vivid prose works of the pre-modern world, observed Heian court life with a wit and precision that still feels modern. Her list-making, her sharp observations of social pretension, her unapologetic subjectivity, all of these anticipate modes of writing that would not become common in Western literature for nearly a millennium. That two of the greatest works of Japanese literary history were written by women, in a society where women were legally and politically subordinate, requires explanation. The explanation lies in the script. When Japan adopted Chinese writing in the 6th and 7th centuries, Chinese characters became the official medium of formal documents, government records, and serious scholarly and religious writing. Men at the Heian court were expected to write in Chinese, which was prestigious, learned, and associated with power. But Chinese was also an acquired second language, and writing in it carried the stylistic constraints and cultural assumptions of another tradition. Women at the Heian court, excluded from the formal educational system that trained men in Chinese composition, used instead the phonetic hiragana script that had developed from simplified Chinese characters to write Japanese directly. This exclusion, which was intended to limit women's access to power, accidentally gave them something more valuable: the freedom to write in their own language. with their own sensibility. Without the weight of Chinese literary convention pressing down on every sentence. The result was a literature of unprecedented psychological intimacy, and its subjects, the textures of daily emotional life, the beauty of natural things, the pain of separation, the comedy of social pretension, turned out to be more durable than anything the formal Chinese tradition produced in Japan. But while the women of the Heian court were producing literature that would outlast their entire civilization, something was happening in the provinces that the court was choosing not to see. The administrative system Japan had imported from China in the 7th and 8th centuries had assumed a strong central government capable of maintaining the nationwide land registration and tax collection that made the system work. By the mid-Heian period, that assumption had quietly collapsed. The great aristocratic families had accumulated private estates, called shun, that were exempt from taxation and immune to government inspection. The provincial governors, appointed by the court, often never even traveled to their assigned provinces, collecting their salaries while leaving actual administration to local deputies. Into the vacuum left by this withdrawal moved a class of people the court regarded with a mixture of contempt and uneasy dependency. Provincial warriors, men trained in the use of the horse, the bow, and the sword, men who had made themselves indispensable to the local management of land and the suppression of endemic low-level violence that characterized provincial life. Men who were accumulating military capability and political experience at precisely the moment when the court was losing both. The court called these men samurai. The word originally meant simply those who serve. Its implications would eventually transform the entire structure of Japanese civilization. But in the mid-Heian period, the court aristocrats still regarded the samurai as useful instruments, not as rivals. They were the muscle that the elegant world of poem writing occasionally required but preferred not to think about. That preference for not thinking about uncomfortable things was itself a symptom of a deeper problem. The Heian aristocracy had built a world of extraordinary beauty and refinement. They had produced a literature that would outlast everything else about their civilization by 1,000 years. But they had done it by progressively withdrawing from any engagement with the actual physical and administrative foundations of their world. History has a way of sending bills to civilizations that stop paying attention to practical reality. Japan's bill arrived in 1156 CE, when a succession dispute over the imperial throne triggered the first of two conflicts that would end the Heian world entirely. The Hogan Rebellion of 1156 CE and the Heiji Rebellion of 1159 and 60 were not large wars by any subsequent standard, but they had consequences entirely disproportionate to their scale. For the first time, samurai warriors were brought into the capital to fight on behalf of competing court factions. The battles were brief and decisive, and when they were over, the lesson that everyone in Heian-kyo had to absorb was inescapable. Military power was real power. Everything else was decoration. The great families of the court had spent 4 centuries perfecting a civilization of astonishing cultural achievement. They had written novels and poems and diaries that would be read for 1,000 years. They had developed an aesthetic sensibility. The concept of mono no aware, the bittersweet recognition of impermanence, that would become one of the defining emotional registers of Japanese culture. And they had entirely failed to notice that the men they employed to do their fighting had grown stronger than they were. The samurai were coming, not as servants, as rulers, and the Japan they were about to create would look nothing like the world of Genji's perfumed sleeves and Sei Shonagon's witty observations. It would be harder, more violent, more rigorously organized, and in some ways, more honest about what power actually required, but it would also carry within it, embedded in its warrior code and its aesthetic sensibility and its relationship to death, more of the Heian world than anyone at the time could have recognized. The poetry did not disappear when the swords came out. It went underground, and it would resurface, transformed, in some of the most unexpected places in Japanese history. Chapter 4. The Rise of the Samurai, When the Sword Replaced the Brush. There is a particular kind of political irony that appears in the history of civilizations with enough regularity to qualify as a pattern. The ruling class, comfortable in its privileges and convinced of its own indispensability, hires people it considers beneath it to do the dangerous work it no longer wants to do itself. And then, over time, those hired people become better at everything that actually matters for survival than the class that hired them. And then one day, the bill comes due. Japan's version of this pattern played out across the 12th century, with a speed and completeness that left the Heian aristocracy almost no time to understand what was happening to them before it was already over. To understand the men who ended the Heian world, you have to understand what they were not. They were not philosophers. They were not poets, though some of them wrote poetry with surprising delicacy. They were not administrators trained in the Chinese models that the court had spent centuries perfecting. They were men who had grown up in the provinces, who knew how to manage horses and weapons and the complex personal loyalties of warrior households, who had learned their politics, not in the elegant chambers of Heian-kyo, but in the hard negotiations of rural land disputes and the sudden violence of provincial conflicts that the court preferred not to hear about. They were, in other words, people who were good at the things that actually kept a civilization alive. And they had been waiting, patient and attentive, for the moment when that would matter more than calligraphy. That moment arrived through the ambitions of a Taira commander named Taira no Kiyomori, whose victory in the Heiji Rebellion of 1159 and 60 left him the most powerful military figure in Japan and gave him something no warrior had ever possessed before: direct access to the imperial court. Kiyomori moved his family to Kyoto. He married his daughters into the imperial family. He accumulated court titles and political influence with a speed that scandalized the aristocrats he was displacing. He was doing something genuinely new. He was trying to become both things at once: a warrior and a courtier, a sword and a brush. And for roughly 20 years, he more or less succeeded. But Kiyomori made the mistake that power tends to invite. He moved too fast, pushed too hard, offended too many people who had long memories and patient ambitions. He exiled former emperors. He elevated his own family at the expense of clans with equally strong claims to precedence. He created, in the process, a coalition of enemies whose hatred of him was the only thing they had in common. Among the survivors of the Minamoto clan that Kiyomori had nearly destroyed was a young man who had been exiled to the Izu Peninsula as a child and who had spent his adolescence in a kind of provincial captivity, learning the landscape and the people of eastern Japan with a thoroughness that would eventually prove decisive. His name was Minamoto no Yoritomo, and where Kiyomori had wanted to join the world of the court, Yoritomo had no such ambition. He wanted to replace it. The Genpei War that erupted in 1180 CE between the Taira and the Minamoto lasted 5 years and produced the stories that Japanese culture would retell for the next 800 years. Its most famous moments belong not to Yoritomo himself but to his younger brother, Minamoto no Yoshitsune, a military commander of intuitive brilliance whose victories At the battles of Ichi no Tani in 1184 and Dan no Ura in 1185, effectively destroyed the Taira as a military force. The Battle of Dan no Ura, fought on the waters of the Shimonoseki Strait, ended with an image that has never left Japanese historical memory. The child emperor, Antoku, just 6 years old, held in his grandmother's arms as she walked into the sea, rather than surrender him to the Minamoto. She told him that beneath the waves lay another capital. Then she walked forward. It is the end of a world rendered not as triumphant conquest, but as tragedy. A grandmother choosing the sea over defeat. A child too young to understand what was happening to him. The Heian world, with all its beauty and all its failures, going down into the water with them. The Tale of the Heike, the great literary chronicle of the Genpei War, compiled in its current form sometime in the 13th century, opens with a passage about the impermanence of all things. The tale that follows is magnificent and melancholy in equal measure, and it is, at its core, about exactly the kind of reckoning the Heian world had been avoiding for a century. What goes up comes down. Power that rests on ceremony rather than capability is power waiting to be taken. But while Yoshitsune was winning the battles, Yoritomo was building something more durable than military victory. Yoritomo remained in Kamakura, a coastal town in eastern Japan, far from the cultural and political gravitational pull of Kyoto. And from that base, he constructed a parallel government. He did not abolish the imperial court or the aristocratic system. He was too intelligent for that. The emperor's symbolic authority was useful, and destroying it would have required a confrontation with religious and cultural legitimacy that even the most powerful samurai leader could not afford to dismiss. Instead, Yoritomo obtained from the court a grant of authority to appoint military stewards to manage estates throughout the country and military governors to oversee the provinces. These positions, filled by his own vassals who owed him personal loyalty, created an administrative network that ran parallel to and increasingly superseded the court's own machinery. In 1192, Yoritomo received from the emperor the title of Sei Taishogun, Great Barbarian Subduing General. In Yoritomo's hands, it became the permanent institutional designation for a new kind of ruler. The Kamakura shogunate was the first of 3 military governments that would govern Japan for the next nearly 700 years. What Yoritomo had invented was a solution to a problem that every complex civilization eventually faces. How do you transfer real power from an institution that has lost the capacity to exercise it, without destroying the symbolic legitimacy that institution provides? The answer Japan developed was to separate the two functions entirely. Keep the symbol in place. Create a new institution to do the actual governing. Let both exist simultaneously, each performing the role it is actually capable of performing. The emperor reigned. The shogun ruled. That distinction, elegant in its simplicity, would define Japanese political structure for 7 centuries. The samurai culture that consolidated during the Kamakura period was not the romanticized world of later legend. The historian Karl F, whose research in his work Hired Swords, published in 2000, represents one of the most rigorous treatments of the subject available, notes that actual samurai were considerably more pragmatic than popular culture has portrayed. They changed sides when their strategic interests demanded it. They prioritized survival and victory over theatrical self-sacrifice in most documented engagements. But the cultural meaning of the samurai was real and consequential, regardless of how imperfectly individual warriors embodied it. The emphasis on discipline, on the acceptance of death, on the cultivation of martial and aesthetic skill simultaneously. These values shaped Japanese culture in ways that extended far beyond the warrior class itself. Zen Buddhism, which arrived in Japan from China in the late 12th and 13th centuries and found its most enthusiastic early adopters among the samurai class, offered a practice of disciplined mental training that resonated with the psychological demands of professional violence. And, from Zen's influence on samurai culture, came an aesthetic that would permeate Japanese civilization for centuries: the preference for understatement over ostentation, the appreciation of imperfection and impermanence, the capacity to find in a single, carefully placed stone, or a bowl of tea, or the sound of rain on a roof, a depth of meaning that more demonstrative arts could not achieve. This is wabi-sabi. It is one of the most distinctly Japanese contributions to world culture, and it came directly from the encounter between warrior psychology and Zen practice in the centuries after Yoritomo built his government beside the sea. The Heian poets had found beauty in the fall of cherry blossoms because it reminded them of impermanence. The samurai who came after them found beauty in the same thing, for the same reason, but approached it from the other direction, not from the cushioned rooms of a palace looking out at a garden, but from the edge of a sword. The poetry had gone underground, and it had come back harder. Chapter 5: Mongols, Typhoons, and the Birth of a Myth. In 1274 CE, a fleet of ships carrying somewhere between 20,000 and 40,000 soldiers appeared in the waters off the northern coast of Kyushu. The estimates vary among historians, and the precise figures remain uncertain. They had crossed from the Korean peninsula, which the Mongol Empire under Kublai Khan had already conquered. They carried weapons that Japan had never encountered: explosive projectiles that detonated on impact, poisoned arrows, massed infantry tactics that had nothing in common with the individual combat protocols that Japanese warriors practiced. The force on those ships represented an extension of the largest contiguous land empire in human history. The Mongols, under Genghis Khan and his successors, had destroyed the Jin dynasty of northern China, conquered Persia, devastated Russia, and pushed into Poland and Hungary before logistical and political constraints turned them back. Kublai Khan, who had completed the conquest of southern China with the fall of the Song dynasty in 1279, controlled more territory than any ruler before him. He had sent envoys to Japan demanding submission. The Kamakura shogunate had refused multiple times. With increasing directness, Kublai Khan was not accustomed to being refused. The first invasion force that landed in Kyushu in 1274 encountered Japanese warriors who fought with genuine courage and were nonetheless being pushed back by the technological and tactical advantages of the Mongol-led force. The weapons the invaders carried were unlike anything the defenders had seen. The tactics were unlike anything Japanese warfare had prepared them for. Individual samurai, challenging enemy champions to single combat, found themselves facing armies that simply moved around them. The defensive situation was becoming critical. Then the weather changed. A storm struck the invasion fleet, and the Mongol commanders made the decision to withdraw to their ships. The storm damaged a significant portion of the fleet, and the invasion force withdrew. Japan had been saved, but not by its samurai. 7 years later, Kublai Khan came back, this time with a force that the historian Thomas Conlin, whose research on the Mongol invasions published in 2001 represents the most thorough recent examination of the primary sources, describes as very large, with the traditional figures in the hundreds of thousands being difficult to verify and possibly inflated in later retellings. Two separate fleets converged on Kyushu from different directions in the summer of 1281. The Japanese defense was more organized this time. The Kamakura government had spent the intervening years building a stone wall along the Hakata Bay coastline, denying the invaders the open beach landing that had allowed them to deploy effectively in the first invasion. Japanese warriors in small boats harassed the anchored fleet with night raids. The invaders were held at the shoreline for weeks, neither able to advance nor willing to retreat. And then, in late August of 1281, the storm came. Not a storm, a typhoon of exceptional severity. The Mongol fleet, anchored in the bay and unable to maneuver, was struck with a force that had no mercy and no strategy and no interest in the ambitions of empires. Underwater excavations conducted by Japanese and American researchers in the early 21st century, locating the remains of Mongol ships on the floor of Hakata Bay, confirmed the scale of the maritime disaster. A very large portion of the invasion force was destroyed. The men who were not drowned were killed on the beaches. The survivors who made it back to their ships sailed away from an island that had just become, in the telling of the people who lived on it, something different from what it had been before. The largest force ever assembled against Japan was gone, and Japan reached immediately for the explanation that its religious tradition made most natural. The storms had not been accidents. They had been divine intervention. Amaterasu and the kami of Japan had sent a divine wind, kamikaze in Japanese, to destroy the enemies of the sacred islands. This was not, in 13th century Japan, an unreasonable conclusion. Medieval people everywhere attributed extreme weather to divine agency. Japan's specific religious tradition, with its emphasis on the active presence of kami in natural phenomena, made the theological reading feel not just plausible, but obvious. Something had protected Japan when nothing human could. The name for that something was not hard to find. But what Japan did with this conclusion over the following centuries is where the story becomes more complicated. And more important, the kamikaze legend grew. It deepened. It became embedded in Japanese political culture in ways that went far beyond the specific typhoons of 1274 and 1281. It became the foundational expression of something the Japanese had always suspected about themselves, but now had evidence for. That Japan was different. That Japan was protected. That when the moment of ultimate threat arrived, something beyond human power would intervene on behalf of the sacred islands. For 600 years, that belief lived in the background of Japanese culture, a reassuring story about the nature of the world and Japan's place in it. And then, in the autumn of 1944, the Japanese military high command gave a specific name to the young men they were sending to fly their aircraft into American warships. They called them kamikaze, the divine wind. They were being asked to become, in the logic of the narrative that had been building since the 1300s, the storm themselves. The distance between those two moments, between the grandmother thanking the kami on a beach in Kyushu in 1281 and the young pilot writing a final letter to his family in 1944, is the distance that a myth travels when it is never questioned. When a story about being saved becomes a story about what you are required to sacrifice. When divine protection becomes divine obligation. But in 1281, none of that was visible. What was visible was the wreckage on the beach and the empty horizon where the fleet had been. And the understanding, spreading through Kamakura and out across Japan, that the islands had survived. The survival came at a cost. Though, a cost that the Kamakura system had no way to pay. The warriors who had defended Kyushu expected rewards in land. That was how Japanese military service had always worked. You fight, you win. You receive land in recognition of what you risked. But the Mongol invasions had been defensive. There was no conquered territory to distribute. The shogunate could offer honors, but not land. And honors without land did not feed families or maintain military households. The resentment that accumulated from this structural failure, combined with inheritance disputes, regional rivalries, and the destabilizing ambitions of Emperor Go-Daigo to produce the collapse of the Kamakura shogunate in 1333. What followed was a period of civil war that would last, with variations in intensity, for more than 2 centuries. Japan fractured into competing regional powers, each lord's authority resting entirely on military capacity. Each relationship between lords defined by a permanent calculation of alliance and betrayal. The storms had saved Japan from the Mongols. There was no divine wind to save the Japanese from each other. Chapter 6. The Century of War, Sengoku, and the Men Who Unified Japan. There's a famous Japanese saying that historians of the Sengoku period return to repeatedly because it captures in 3 short portraits something that would take pages of analysis to explain any other way. Oda Nobunaga pounds the rice cake. Toyotomi Hideyoshi kneads it. Tokugawa Ieyasu sits down and eats it. The saying is not entirely fair to any of the 3 men, but it is accurate about the essential truth of what each one contributed to the unification of Japan, and why all 3 were necessary, and why the order in which they appeared mattered as much as anything they individually did. To understand what Nobunaga was walking into when he began his rise to power in the 1550s, you have to understand what a century of the Sengoku period had actually produced. Japan was not simply a country at war with itself. It was a country whose entire social order had been liquefied by sustained conflict. The old hierarchies were not just challenged. They were functionally dissolved in many regions. A farmer's son could become a general if he was talented enough and ruthless enough and lucky enough. A great lord could lose everything overnight to a vassal who decided that this was the moment to strike. The concept of Gekkokuyo, the low overturning the high, had become not just a possibility, but almost a defining feature of the age. This social liquefaction was terrifying and destructive. It was also, in ways that only became visible in retrospect, productive. The men who rose through the Sengoku period by ability rather than birth had a relationship with power that was fundamentally different from that of the hereditary aristocrats they replaced. They had earned what they held. They knew exactly what it had cost. And they had no illusions about what would happen if they stopped paying attention. Nobunaga was born in 1534 as the son of a minor lord controlling a small domain in Owari province in central Japan. His early reputation was not promising. Contemporary accounts describe him as the fool of Owari, a young man given to wandering the streets, eating food with his hands, behaving with a casual disregard for the formalities of samurai culture that scandalized the people around him. What is clear is that when Nobunaga took control of his domain after his father's death in 1551, the fool turned out to have a mind of extraordinary strategic clarity and a willingness to use violence in ways that his contemporaries found genuinely shocking. The Battle of Okehazama in 1560 announced Nobunaga to the wider world, the most powerful lord in central Japan. Imagawa Yoshimoto was marching through Owari with an army estimated at 25,000 men. Nobunaga's available force was perhaps 2,000, every conventional military calculation pointed to the same conclusion: submission or flight. Nobunaga attacked. He used a sudden violent thunderstorm as cover, leading his small force in a concentrated assault directly on Yoshimoto's camp, while the larger army was sheltered and disorganized by the rain. Yoshimoto was killed. His army dissolved. One man decided to attack when every rational calculation said not to, and in doing so, he announced to every lord watching from the provinces that the old rules no longer applied, that the Sengoku world rewarded a specific kind of courage that the Heian world would never have understood. Not the courage of the single champion riding forward to announce his lineage before the battle. The courage of the commander who sees an opening that nobody else sees and acts on it before the moment closes. Over the following 2 decades, Nobunaga expanded his control across central Japan with speed and systematic ruthlessness. His assault on the Enryakuji temple complex on Mount Hiei in 1571, which resulted in the burning of the monastery and the deaths of thousands of monks, civilians, and soldiers sheltering there, shocked even the standards of a violent age. His policy of Rakuichi Rakuza, free markets and free guilds, abolished merchant monopolies that had restricted commerce throughout the medieval period, and at the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, he deployed massed arquebusiers in coordinated rotating volleys behind defensive palisades to destroy the cavalry charges of the Takeda clan. The historian Stephen Turnbull, whose work on samurai warfare includes detailed treatment of this engagement, notes that while some specifics of Nobunaga's formation have been debated by subsequent scholars, the fundamental point stands. Nobunaga understood that technology had changed what was possible in battle, and he reorganized his military practice around that understanding faster than anyone else did. He was also, it must be said, a man who collected European clocks, wore Portuguese clothing, and found Christianity interesting enough to protect its missionaries from persecution. Not because he believed in it, but because he found its challenge to Buddhist institutional power politically useful. He was, in ways that his contemporaries found disorienting and his enemies found dangerous, genuinely new. By 1582, Nobunaga controlled roughly a third of Japan and was the most powerful figure in the country. The unification that had seemed impossible for a century was beginning to look achievable within his lifetime. Then, on the morning of the 21st of June, 1582, one of his own generals surrounded the temple at Honnoji in Kyoto, where Nobunaga was staying with a small retinue, and set it on fire. The general's name was Akechi Mitsuhide. His reasons for the betrayal remain genuinely unclear to historians, a subject of active scholarly debate. What is unambiguous is that Nobunaga, surrounded and with no possibility of escape, died in the burning temple, whether by his own hand or in the fire. The sources do not definitively establish. The man who had cracked Japan open, who had broken the century-old deadlock through sheer force of will and strategic brilliance, died not in battle, but by the hand of someone he trusted. It is the kind of ending that feels both completely wrong and completely right for a man who had spent his life doing things that were not supposed to be possible. The rice cake was unfinished. Someone else would have to knead it. That someone was already moving. Toyotomi Hideyoshi was, by the circumstances of his birth, the least likely candidate for the role he was about to play. Born sometime around 1537 in a peasant family in Owari, he had no samurai lineage. no hereditary claim to any position, and no physical advantages. Contemporary descriptions suggest he was short, slight, and possessed of a face that earned him the nickname Saru, the monkey, from Nobunaga himself. What he had was an intelligence of extraordinary practical flexibility, the ability to read people and situations with a speed and accuracy that repeatedly turned disadvantage into opportunity. He had risen through Nobunaga's service from the most humble beginnings to become one of the most trusted generals in the Oda army. That trajectory was only possible in the social liquefaction of the Sengoku period, and he had used every moment of it to learn exactly how power worked and what it required. When news of Nobunaga's death reached Hideyoshi, he was in the middle of a military campaign in western Japan. Within days, he had negotiated a peace settlement with his opponents, turned his army around, and marched east at a speed that Akechi Mitsuhide had not anticipated. 11 days after Nobunaga's death, Hideyoshi met Mitsuhide's forces at the Battle of Yamazaki. Mitsuhide was defeated and killed. Hideyoshi had avenged his lord, and in doing so had established himself as the legitimate heir to Nobunaga's unification project. The decade that followed transformed Japan. Hideyoshi defeated or outmaneuvered the remaining major lords who contested his supremacy, sometimes through military force and sometimes through negotiation backed by the implicit threat of overwhelming force. By 1590, Hideyoshi controlled all of Japan. The unification that Nobunaga had cracked open was complete. But Hideyoshi's domestic policy was as consequential as his military campaigns. The sword hunt of 1588 ordered the confiscation of weapons from the non-samurai population, beginning the process of hardening the class boundaries that the Sengoku period had dissolved. The Separation Edict of 1591 formally prohibited movement between the social classes of samurai, farmers, artisan, and merchants. A peasant's son who became ruler of Japan was sealing the door behind him to prevent anyone else from doing the same thing. He also made the decision that most historians consider his greatest strategic error. He invaded Korea twice, in 1592 and 1597. Both invasions ended without achieving their objectives, at enormous cost in Japanese and Korean and Chinese lives. The Korean campaigns left a legacy of damage and memory that shaped Korean-Japanese relations for centuries. And they exhausted the resources of many daimyo who participated, creating resentments that became politically relevant the moment Hideyoshi died. He died in 1598, leaving behind a young son named Toyotomi Hideyori and a council of regents. The most powerful of those regents was a man who had spent his entire career playing a role that, in retrospect, looks almost too perfectly calculated for the outcome it produced. Tokugawa Ieyasu had been one of Nobunaga's most important allies and then one of Hideyoshi's most carefully managed potential rivals. He was the lord of a large domain in eastern Japan, a man of enormous military resources and even more enormous patience. He had waded through Nobunaga's rise, served under Hideyoshi's dominance, and outlasted both of them through the simple expedient of not dying and not making the mistake that would give his enemies the justification they needed to destroy him. When Hideyoshi died, Ieyasu moved, not immediately and not obviously, but with the inexorable patience that characterized everything he did. He built alliances, he arranged marriages, and in 1600, at the Battle of Sekigahara, he met the coalition that had formed to oppose him. The Battle of Sekigahara, on the 21st of October, 1600, lasted a single day. Roughly 160,000 soldiers fought on a mountain plain in central Japan. And by nightfall, the political map of Japan had been redrawn permanently. Ieyasu's victory gave him a dominance so complete that resistance became functionally irrational. In 1603, he received the title of shogun. In 1605, he transferred it to his son, establishing beyond any doubt that the Tokugawa family intended to hold the shogunate permanently. He lived until 1616, long enough to destroy the last serious threat to Tokugawa dominance at the sieges of Osaka Castle in 1614 and 1615, where Toyotomi Hideyoshi died along with the last realistic possibility of anyone challenging what Ieyasu had built. The rice cake was eaten. 3 men, 3 completely different characters. One outcome that none of them, working alone, could have produced. Nobunaga broke the deadlock. Hideyoshi completed the unification. Ieyasu institutionalized it. And what Ieyasu institutionalized was about to produce something that none of them could have anticipated. Not another century of war, but 250 years of a peace so deliberate, so comprehensive, and so strange that the world has never seen anything quite like it before or since. Chapter 7. The Great Silence, Edo, Japan, and the 250-year experiment. Before we talk about what the Tokugawa built, spend a moment inside it. It is a morning in Edo, sometime in the 1700s. You are a merchant's son, 17 years old, walking through the Nihonbashi district on your way to the family shop that sells lacquerware to other merchants and occasionally, if the season has been good, to the retainers of minor lords who pass through the city on their way to the great daimyo mansions. The streets around you are not quiet. They are never quiet. Fishmongers are calling out prices from stalls that have been open since before dawn. A group of samurai in formal dress moves through the crowd with the careful dignity of men who are acutely aware of their status and somewhat less certain of their finances. Somewhere in a nearby alley, a kabuki actor is arguing loudly with someone about a role. From a tea house 2 streets over comes the sound of shamisen music, beginning the day's entertainment for customers who will sit there until they are asked to leave. Overhead, a kite seller is demonstrating his wares to a group of children who have not yet been collected by their mothers for the walk to the neighborhood temple school where they will learn to read and calculate and sit still, which is perhaps the most difficult of the 3. The city around you holds more than 1 million people. It is, at this moment in history, the largest city in the world, and it has been at peace for nearly 100 years. This is the Japan that the Tokugawa shogunate, established by Ieyasu in 1603, actually produced, not the sealed, stagnant, backward society of later caricature, a city of extraordinary vitality, creativity, and commercial sophistication, governed by a system so carefully designed to prevent political disruption that it accidentally created the conditions for one of the great flowerings of popular culture in human history. The mechanism that made it work was the Senkinkotai system, formalized in 1635, which required every daimyo in Japan to spend alternating years in Edo and in their home domain. When a daimyo returned home, his family remained in Edo. When he came to Edo, his domain was effectively unguarded. The system had multiple consequences the Tokugawa understood perfectly. It kept the great lords under surveillance for half of every year. It kept their families permanently as hostages. And it required every daimyo to maintain 2 complete households and to fund the enormous expense of traveling between them with an appropriate retinue. A lord spending half his income on ceremonial travel could not afford an army large enough to threaten Edo. The political architecture that sealed Japan from foreign entanglement was equally precise. The series of edicts issued between 1633 and 1639, which historians group under the term sakoku, or closed country, did not seal Japan in hermetic isolation. They imposed a carefully calibrated system of controlled contact that permitted trade with the Dutch and the Chinese at the single port of Nagasaki, allowed limited interaction with Korea, and maintained diplomatic relations with the Ryukyu kingdom. What they prohibited was the kind of uncontrolled missionary activity and the political connections between Japanese Christians and foreign powers that the Tokugawa regarded as a structural threat to their system. The suppression of Christianity in Japan, which culminated in the Shimabara Rebellion of 1637 and 38 and its brutal suppression, was not simply religious persecution, though it was certainly that. It was the Tokugawa recognizing that a religion whose ultimate loyalty reached outside Japan was structurally incompatible with a political system built on total internal control. Their methods of addressing this incompatibility were characterized by a violence that cannot be read about today without recognition of the human cost involved. The social hierarchy the Tokugawa formalized placed samurai at the top, then farmers, then artisan, then merchants. The merchant class occupied a theoretically low position because Confucian reasoning held that merchants produced nothing and merely moved goods produced by others. This made sense as social philosophy and complete nonsense as economic description. Merchants accumulated wealth that frequently exceeded that of the samurai, who nominally outranked them. By the 18th century, indebted samurai borrowing money from prosperous merchants was one of the defining social ironies of an era built on the pretense that status and capability were the same thing. They were not the same thing, and the gap between them was generating something in the cities that the architects of the Tokugawa system had not planned for. The Chonin, the townspeople of Edo period cities, developed a popular culture that was democratic in everything but name. The kabuki theater drew its audiences from merchants and artisans, and the laboring population as much as from samurai. Its stories of love, betrayal, loyalty, and revenge spoke to human experiences that cut across status boundaries in ways that court poetry never could and never tried to. Katsushika Hokusai spent his entire working life producing images that ordinary people could afford to own. His 36 views of Mount Fuji, produced in the early 1830s when he was in his 70s and still refining his craft, contains compositions of such geometric audacity and emotional precision that Western artists who encountered them in the second half of the 19th century had to completely revise what they thought was possible in visual art. The Great Wave off Kanagawa, perhaps the most reproduced Japanese image in history, is not the picture of a serene and timeless Japan. It is a picture of overwhelming force, of the smallness of human craft against the indifference of water, of the volcano standing calm in the distance while the wave closes in on the fishing boats below. It is a picture made by a man who had paid very close attention to the world around him for 70 years and had found, in a single wave, everything he wanted to say about it. Matsuo Basho, a century earlier, had done the same thing with 17 syllables. His frog poem, written in 1686, presents a single moment with such precision that the moment opens into something much larger. An old pond. A frog jumps in. The sound of water. In the space between the jump and the sound, between the silence before and the silence after, Basho placed the entire emotional weight of a civilization that had learned to find meaning in what was not said, This is wabi-sabi again. The same sensibility that the samurai had brought back from the edge of death. The same appreciation of impermanence and incompleteness that the Heian poets had felt in the fall of cherry blossoms. Now available in a woodblock print that a fishmonger's daughter could buy for a few copper coins and hang on the wall of a 2-room house in the middle of the largest city in the world. The samurai of the Tokugawa period faced an existential problem that the system had created and could not resolve. They were a warrior class in a country that had not fought a significant war in 200 years. The historian, Eiko Ikegami, in her study of samurai culture, published in 1995, argues that the formalization of Bushido, the way of the warrior, as a philosophical and ethical system during this period was partly a response to this crisis. A warrior class trying to find meaning and identity in the absence of the function that originally defined them. The Hagakure, a compilation of the views of the samurai Yamamoto Tsunetomo recorded in the early 18th century, articulated the most extreme version of this search in a line that has become one of the most quoted in Japanese cultural history. The way of the samurai is found in death. A man who has accepted his own death before it comes, Yamamoto argued, has nothing left to fear, and therefore nothing left to lose, and nothing left to calculate. He can act with perfect clarity. It is a philosophy born from having nothing left to do except think about what you would do if there were something to do. The Kokugaku movement, national learning, applied rigorous philological methods to the recovery of ancient Japanese texts and began constructing an argument about Japanese cultural identity that had no need of Chinese precedent. Scholars including Modowori Norinaga, whose monumental work on the tale of Genji and the ancient chronicles occupied decades of his life, were doing something that looked like literary scholarship and was also, underneath the surface, a quiet but consequential political argument. Japan had its own tradition, its own spirit, its own relationship to its origins that was not derivative of China and not inferior to anything the continent had produced. That argument was being assembled in precisely the period when the Tokugawa system was demonstrating, year by year, that it could not adapt to the world that was forming beyond its sealed borders. The pressure inside was building. The argument about who Japan truly was would provide the ideological fuel for everything that happened next. The fiscal structure that funded the entire system was fixed to land surveys conducted in the early 17th century. As population grew and the urban economy expanded, the gap between the wealth being generated in the cities and the tax revenue the shogunate could extract from the countryside widened into a structural fiscal crisis that periodic reforms could temporarily address but never solve. Famines struck repeatedly, most devastatingly in the 1730s and 1780s, producing social unrest and in some cases outright rebellion that the shogunate suppressed but could not prevent from recurring. By the early 19th century, the pressure inside the Tokugawa system had reached a level that the system had no mechanism to release. A merchant's son walking through Nihonbashi in the 1700s could not feel any of this. His city was alive and loud and full of possibility for people with his skills and his energy. The world his grandfather had described, of warlords and burning castles and armies moving across the rice fields, felt safely ancient. The world was stable. It had always been stable. It would always be stable. He was wrong, but he could not have known it yet. The signal that would end his world was still a generation away, still taking shape in the dockyard of a distant country his grandfather had never heard of, in the form of a machine that burned coal and moved ships without wind. When that machine arrived in Edo Bay, the 250-year experiment would be over. and everything Japan had built in the silence would have to decide whether it was strong enough to survive the sound. Chapter 8. Black Ships and the End of Silence, the Meiji Restoration. There is a specific kind of terror that comes not from violence, but from the sudden, visceral recognition that everything you believed about your place in the world is wrong. On the morning of the 8th of July, 1853, the people living along the coastline of Edo Bay looked out at the water and saw something that had no place in the world they understood. 4 warships, 2 of them driven not by wind and sail, but by steam engines that belched black smoke into the morning air, sat at anchor in waters that no foreign vessel had entered uninvited in more than 200 years. They were painted black. Their gun ports were open. By some estimates, they carried more than 60 cannons between them. The commander of the squadron was Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States Navy. His instructions from President Millard Fillmore were to open Japan to American trade and to secure agreements that would protect American sailors shipwrecked in Japanese waters. Perry had been given considerable discretion about how to achieve these objectives. He had chosen to achieve them through what diplomatic historians call gunboat diplomacy, the presentation of demands backed by the implicit threat of overwhelming force. The Tokugawa authorities who rode out to meet him were told to convey a letter from President Fillmore to the shogun. Perry made clear that he would return the following year for a response. Then he sailed away and left a country in pieces. For 250 years, the Tokugawa system had maintained its authority partly on the premise that the outside world was manageable, that Japan's controlled contact with it through the single window of Nagasaki was sufficient, that the great powers beyond the horizon were far enough away and different enough from Japan that the question of comparison did not need to be raised. Perry's black ships raised it in a single morning and could not be unraised. The scholars of Rangaku, Dutch learning, had known for decades that the Industrial Revolution had transformed Western military capabilities in ways that the Tokugawa system had never accounted for. The cannons on those ships were not the cannons that Portuguese traders had introduced in the 1540s. They were the product of 2 centuries of metallurgical and engineering development that had happened while Japan was sealed. The steam engines driving 2 of the ships were not technology that existed anywhere in the Tokugawa world. The gap between what Japan had and what those ships represented was not a gap that could be closed by determination alone. To understand why Perry's arrival was so destabilizing, you have to understand that it did not just threaten Japan militarily. It threatened the ideological foundation of the Tokugawa system itself. The system's claim to legitimacy rested on its ability to maintain order and protect Japan from external disruption. Standing on the shore watching black smoke rise from ships that Japan had no effective answer to, every thoughtful person in the Tokugawa establishment was asking the same question. If the system cannot protect Japan, why does the system deserve to govern Japan? That question had no comfortable answer, and it spread through Japanese political culture with a speed that the shogunate could not contain. Perry returned in February of 1854 with 8 ships. The Convention of Kanagawa, signed on the 31st of March, 1854, opened 2 Japanese ports to American ships. The Harris Treaty of 1858, negotiated by American Consul Townsend Harris over several years of difficult discussions, went much further, opening additional ports, establishing fixed tariffs that limited Japan's control over its own trade, and granting Americans extraterritorial legal rights on Japanese soil. The unequal treaties, as they became known, were a humiliation. The tariff limitations meant Japan could not protect its own industries. The extraterritoriality provisions meant foreign citizens in Japan were subject to their own nation's laws rather than Japanese law. These treaties became, in the political discourse of the following decades, the symbol of everything that was wrong with the Tokugawa system and everything that needed to change. The political movement that formed around this resentment crystallized around the slogan Sono Joi, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. It drew its energy from two sources that were not naturally compatible but found temporary common cause. One source was the Kokugaku tradition of national learning, which had been arguing for decades that Japan's authentic identity was rooted in its imperial tradition and that the shogunate was a usurpation of the emperor's rightful authority. The other was the practical military frustration of domains like Choshu and Satsuma in western Japan, whose leaders understood that Japan needed to modernize its military capabilities rapidly and believed the Tokugawa shogunate was incapable of managing that transformation. The joy part of the slogan, expel the barbarians, died quickly as a practical program. When Choshu Domain fired on Western ships in the Shimonoseki Strait in 1863, a combined Western naval force responded in 1864 with a bombardment that destroyed Choshu's coastal fortifications in an afternoon. The military impossibility of literal expulsion became undeniable. What survived the slogan's failure as a military program was its success as a political one. The shogunate's inability to expel anyone had confirmed what its critics were arguing. The old system could not defend Japan. What died more slowly was the Tokugawa shogunate itself. The Boshin War of 1868 and 69, fought between forces loyal to the Tokugawa and a coalition of domains fighting in the name of imperial restoration, ended with the fall of the shogunate. But the way it ended matters as much as the fact that it ended. The last Tokugawa shogun, Yoshinobu, made the calculation that resistance would produce a destructive civil war whose costs would fall on the country as a whole, and chose to surrender his political authority rather than fight a war he was uncertain of winning. That decision, made by a man watching everything his family had built for 250 years being dismantled around him, was not cowardice. It was, arguably, the most consequential act of political wisdom in the entire crisis. Japan's transition from the old regime to the new was accomplished with a fraction of the violence that comparable transitions had required in other countries. The system was removed from power without being destroyed. The people who had served it could be redirected rather than purged. The Meiji Restoration, proclaimed in January of 1868, was announced through a document called the Charter Oath, issued in the name of the 16-year-old Emperor Meiji in April of that year. Its 5 articles committed the new government to deliberative assemblies, the abandonment of old customs, the pursuit of knowledge throughout the world, and the fulfillment of the aspirations of all people. It was a document carefully designed to mean different things to different readers. To reformers, it promised transformation. To conservatives, it promised deliberation. To the Western powers watching from their treaty ports, it signaled a government that intended to engage with the world rather than resist it. What it actually announced, though none of the people who drafted it could have fully known this in 1868, was one of the most rapid and comprehensive state-directed modernizations in modern history. The men who drove the Meiji transformation were not idealists. They were pragmatists of the highest order. Young samurai from Choshu and Satsuma and other domains who had watched the Western military demonstrations of the 1860s with cold analytical attention and reached conclusions they acted on with remarkable consistency. Japan had to become powerful enough that the Western nations would renegotiate the unequal treaties. Becoming that powerful required industrialization. A modern military, a modern legal system, a modern educational system, and a centralized state capable of directing all of these simultaneously. The traditional structures that stood in the way had to be removed. They removed them. In 1871, the domains that had been the basic units of Japanese political organization since the Sengoku period were abolished and replaced with centrally administered prefectures. The samurai class, which had defined Japanese social structure for 7 centuries, was progressively stripped of its privileges. The stipends that had maintained samurai households were commuted to government bonds in 1876, and in the same year, the right to wear swords in public, the most visible symbol of samurai status, was prohibited. The reaction was violent. The Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, led by Saigo Takamori, a hero of the Meiji Restoration who had become disillusioned with the direction of the new government, was the last significant armed resistance to the transformation. It was suppressed by the new conscript army, trained on Western models, built precisely to replace the samurai military system. The symbolism was deliberate and complete. The new Japan was defeating the old Japan in the field, with weapons and tactics the old Japan had never imagined. Here, at the completion of the first great rebuild, it is worth stopping for a moment to feel what had just happened. A political system that had governed Japan for nearly 700 years had been dismantled in less than a decade. The class of warriors who had been the foundation of that system had been legally dissolved. The borders that had been sealed for 250 years had been thrown open. And all of it had been done not by foreign invasion, not by popular revolution in the European sense, but by Japanese hands, moving with deliberate speed, in the service of a vision of survival that was entirely their own. They had looked at the gap between what Japan was and what it needed to become. They had felt the humiliation of the unequal treaties. They had watched their country fall behind in the most consequential dimension of 19th century power, and instead of defending the system that had produced the gap, they had dismantled it. This is the first complete answer to the spine question this documentary opened with. Japan collapsed forward in 1868 because it understood, faster than almost any other civilization in comparable circumstances, that the old system could not be reformed from within. It had to be replaced, and the people who replaced it were disciplined enough, and clear-eyed enough, and honest enough about what was true, to build something new without losing the thread of what made Japan itself. The question that 1868 left open was whether the collapse could be controlled precisely enough to build what Japan needed without producing something that would eventually destroy everything the rebuild had achieved. The answer to that question would take another 80 years to arrive. Chapter 9. The Student Who Became a Rival. Meiji Japan's Transformation. In December of 1871, a ship left Yokohama carrying one of the strangest diplomatic missions in modern history. The Iwakura mission, named for its chief envoy Iwakura Tomomi, consisted of nearly 50 senior government officials, including some of the most powerful figures in the Meiji leadership, accompanied by roughly 60 students who would remain abroad for extended periods of study. The mission's stated purpose was to renegotiate the unequal treaties. Its actual purpose, understood by everyone involved, was education. The leaders of the new Japan were going to look at the most powerful countries in the world, study everything those countries had done to become powerful, and bring the lessons home. The mission spent nearly 2 years traveling through the United States, Britain, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, Russia, and other countries. They visited factories, schools, hospitals, courts, legislatures, shipyards, and military installations. They met presidents, prime ministers, and industrialists. They took notes on everything with a directness that sometimes surprised their hosts. The account compiled by mission member Kume Kunitake, published in Japanese in 1878 and available in English translation as the Iwakura Embassy, is a document of extraordinary analytical precision. Kume did not simply describe what he saw. He compared, evaluated, and drew conclusions about what Japan needed to adopt and why. Reading it today is a reminder that the Meiji transformation was not a blind import of Western institutions. It was a selective, critical engagement conducted by people who understood very clearly what they were trying to achieve. What the Iwakura mission found was not a single model of modernity, but a set of competing models, each with its own strengths and its own relationship to the specific conditions that had produced it. The Meiji leaders returned to Japan having decided that different aspects of different models were appropriate for different Japanese purposes. The German model for the army and for the constitutional structure, the British model for the navy, the French model for the legal code, the American model for primary education. The result was a synthesis that was, by design, Japanese in its ultimate configuration, even when its components were foreign in their origin. The speed of what followed is genuinely difficult to convey without specific examples that anchor the abstraction. In 1872, Japan opened its first railway line, connecting Tokyo and Yokohama. By 1900, the national rail network extended to more than 6,000 kilometers. In 1872, a new national education system was established, mandating compulsory primary education for both boys and girls. By 1890, Japan's literacy rate had reached levels comparable to many European nations. In 1882, the Bank of Japan was established on the model of European central banks. In 1889, the Meiji Constitution was promulgated, creating a bicameral legislature and a cabinet system. The textile industry led the early phase of industrialization. The historian E. Patricia Tsurumi, whose study, Factory Girls, published in 1990, examines this period in detail, describes conditions in the silk and cotton mills as often harsh and sometimes exploitative, built primarily on the labor of young women recruited from farming households across the country. The human cost of Japan's industrialization was real, and honest historical treatment requires acknowledging it alongside the aggregate economic achievement. But the most consequential test of the Meiji transformation was not economic. It was military. In 1894, Japan went to war with China over influence in Korea. The First Sino-Japanese War lasted 8 months. The outcome stunned the world. Japan's modernized military defeated the Qing dynasty's forces on land and at sea with a decisiveness that contemporary observers found almost incomprehensible. China, the civilization that Japan had spent 15 centuries looking to as the source of culture, philosophy, and political wisdom, had been defeated by its former student in less time than it takes for a harvest to come in. The Treaty of Shimonoseki in 1895 gave Japan Taiwan, which became its first overseas colony. Along with significant territorial and financial concessions, the Liaodong Peninsula was immediately forced back by Russia, France, and Germany in what became known as the Triple Intervention, a humiliation that the Japanese public did not forget and that shaped Japanese strategic thinking for the decade that followed. The decade that followed produced the most dramatic proof of the Meiji transformation's success. In 1904, Japan went to war with Russia. Russia in 1904 was a European great power, with an empire stretching from Poland to the Pacific. Its army was enormous, its navy significant, and its political class largely dismissive of the possibility that an Asian nation could pose a serious military challenge. The Tsar's advisors described the coming conflict as a short, victorious war. They were wrong on every count. The Japanese army fought a grinding campaign of extraordinary cost in Manchuria before forcing the surrender of the Russian fortress at Port Arthur in January of 1905, after a siege that lasted nearly a year. The land campaign at Mukden in February and March of 1905 involved more than 600,000 combatants and produced casualties on a scale that anticipated the industrial warfare of the First World War. But the decisive moment came at sea. The Russian Baltic Fleet had sailed around the world in an 8-month voyage, the longest naval deployment in modern history at that point, to reinforce Russian power in the Pacific. It arrived in the Tsushima Strait in May of 1905, exhausted, far from any friendly port, sailing into waters it did not know toward an enemy that had been waiting for it. Admiral Togo Heihachiro, commanding the Japanese combined fleet, executed a precise turning maneuver at the opening of the engagement that concentrated his fleet's firepower on the leading Russian ships before they could respond effectively. What followed was, by the records of both navies, one of the most complete naval victories in modern history. The great majority of the Russian fleet's major warships were sunk, captured, or forced to seek internment in neutral ports within 2 days of fighting. Japanese losses were confined to torpedo boats. Now stop for a moment and hold the full weight of what had just happened. 37 years earlier, Japan had been a feudal society with samurai on horseback and a political system that had not changed in 2 centuries. It had been forced to open its ports by warships it had no answer for. It had signed treaties that treated it as a subordinate, as a country that could not be trusted to govern trade within its own waters, or to apply its own laws to foreigners on its own soil. And now it had just destroyed the navy of the Russian Empire. In every colonial territory across Asia and Africa, in every country where people had been told that European dominance was natural and permanent and simply the way the world was organized, people read the news from Tsushima and understood that something had changed. The historian Christopher Bailey, in his study of the modern world, published in 2004, describes the Japanese victory in the Russo-Japanese War as one of the events that most powerfully undermined the ideology of European racial and civilizational superiority that had justified imperialism across the world. What Japan had done, it had done in less than 40 years, starting from nothing that looked like what it became. Within 40 years of the Meiji Restoration, Japan had built railways and a modern navy, created a constitutional government, industrialized its economy, reformed its legal system, defeated both China and Russia, and acquired an overseas empire. The student had become a rival. The Meiji emperor died in 1912. The historian Donald Keene, whose biography of the Meiji emperor, published in 2002, is the most comprehensive in English, presents a figure of genuine intelligence and seriousness who grew into his role over decades and who understood, by the end of his reign, what his name had come to mean. What his name had come to mean was proof. Proof that the collapse forward was possible, that a civilization could look at the gap between what it was and what it needed to become, and close that gap through intelligence, discipline, and the willingness to do things that had never been done before. That proof was real, and it was about to be used in ways that the men who created it would not have recognized and would not have wanted. Chapter 10. The Road to Ruin Militarism, Empire, and World War II. There is a particular kind of catastrophe that does not arrive all at once. It arrives in increments, in a decision that seems reasonable given the pressures of the moment, in a silence that feels safer than speaking, in an institution that stops asking whether it should do something and focuses entirely on whether it can, in a population that has been told, for decades, a story about itself that makes the catastrophic decision feel not just acceptable, but inevitable and right. Japan's road to the Second World War was exactly this kind of catastrophe. It was not the product of a single madman seizing control of a healthy state. It was the product of structural pressures that had been building since the Meiji period. A political culture with specific vulnerabilities that were exploited by specific people at specific moments. And a sequence of decisions in which the people who might have said no chose, repeatedly, to say nothing. The Meiji constitutional order had been designed by men who admired the German model of a strong executive constrained by a legislature of limited authority. The constitution concentrated enormous power in institutions that were not accountable to the elected parliament. The army and navy reported not to the cabinet, but directly to the emperor. A provision whose practical consequence was that the military services could operate independently of civilian government control. The cabinet required the cooperation of the army and navy ministers to function. And since those ministers were active duty officers appointed by their respective services, the military could bring down any civilian government it opposed, simply by withdrawing its minister. This was not a flaw in the constitutional design. It was a feature built in by men who believed that Japan's security required military institutions insulated from the messiness of democratic politics. It worked, after a fashion. As long as the military leadership and the civilian political leadership shared broadly compatible visions of Japan's direction. When they stopped sharing that vision in the late 1920s and early 1930s, the constitutional structure provided the military with tools to dominate civilian government that no democratic mechanism could effectively counter. The pressures that drove the divergence were real and serious. The Great Kanto earthquake of September 1923 had killed more than 100,000 people in the Tokyo-Yokohama region and caused economic damage that set back Japanese recovery for years. The global depression that followed the Wall Street crash of 1929 hit Japan's export-dependent economy with devastating force. Silk prices, which underpinned the rural economy of much of Japan, collapsed by more than half between 1929 and 1931. Farming families in the northeastern regions of Japan faced starvation conditions while the cities continued to function with relative normalcy. The gap between rural suffering and urban indifference created a resentment that would have political consequences. Into this climate came political movements that offered explanations and solutions of a specific kind. The problem, they argued, was not Japan's direction, but its deviation from its true path. Japan had been corrupted by Western individualism, by party politics that served factional interests rather than national ones, by capitalists who enriched themselves while farmers starved. The solution was a return to Japanese essence, a purification of the national body through the restoration of direct imperial rule, and an activist foreign policy that would secure the resources Japan needed. These ideas circulated most intensely among junior and middle grade officers in the army, men who came disproportionately from the rural families that the Depression had hit hardest. They were not uniquely violent or uniquely irrational. They were men responding to real problems with solutions shaped by the intellectual and institutional environment they had been formed in. And the institutional environment they had been formed in had given them a constitutional structure that made their solutions very difficult to resist. The Manchurian Incident of September 1931 was the moment that demonstrated how completely civilian control of the military had collapsed. Officers of the Kwantung Army, the Japanese force stationed in Manchuria under treaty rights, staged a bomb explosion on the South Manchuria Railway near Mukden, used it as a pretext to launch military operations against Chinese forces, and within months had conquered the entire region, organizing it into the puppet state of Manchukuo. The civilian government in Tokyo had not ordered the operation. It had not been consulted. When the cabinet attempted to limit the scope of the military action, the field commanders ignored the instructions. The government found itself unable to enforce its own orders. The historian Louise Young, in her study, Japan's Total Empire, published in 1998, describes the Manchurian Incident as a turning point, not just in foreign policy, but in the domestic political structure. The moment when the precedent of military insubordination producing successful outcomes became embedded in institutional practice. The February 26 incident of 1936 brought the crisis inside Japan itself. A group of young army officers led approximately 1,400 soldiers in an uprising in Tokyo, assassinating several senior government officials and occupying key government buildings for 4 days before the rebellion was suppressed. Its leaders were executed, but the effects on Japanese political culture were precisely the opposite of what the suppression might suggest. The moderate politicians and military leaders who remained in power afterward had watched colleagues murdered by radical officers and drawn a conclusion that, while humanly understandable, was politically catastrophic. Opposing the military radicals was dangerous. Accommodating them was safer. The silences that followed, in cabinet meetings and parliamentary sessions and newspaper editorial offices, were not the silences of people who had forgotten how to speak. They were the silences of people who had decided that speaking was too costly. A democracy dies in many ways, sometimes loudly, in a single dramatic seizure of power, and sometimes quietly, in 100 small decisions by reasonable people who decide that this particular moment is not the right moment to push back, who tell themselves they will speak when the time is right, who never find the right time. The historian Herbert P, in his Pulitzer Prize-winning study Hirohito and the Making of Modern Japan, published in 2000, argues that Emperor Hirohito's role in the drift toward war was considerably more active than the post-war narrative of a powerless constitutional monarch had suggested. Bix's analysis presents a Hirohito who was engaged with military planning, who asked pointed questions about strategic options, and who provided the imperial sanction that gave military operations their legitimacy. The historian Carol Gluck and others have engaged with Bix's argument in ways that modify some of its strongest claims. But the broad point that Hirohito was not simply a passive figurehead is now part of the mainstream scholarly understanding of the period. The war in China that began with the Marco Polo Bridge incident of July 7, 1937, started as a local clash near Beijing and escalated into a full-scale conflict through a sequence of decisions that neither government fully controlled. The events in Nanjing in December 1937 and January 1938, in which Japanese forces killed large numbers of Chinese civilians and prisoners of war, are documented by evidence that the scholarly consensus does not seriously dispute. The precise death toll remains a subject of ongoing historical debate, with estimates varying substantially across different scholarly studies, including the work of historians such as Tokushi Kasahara and Da-King Yang, who represent different positions in a careful academic discussion about the specific figures. What is not in dispute is that mass killing occurred, that it was systematic and sustained over weeks, and that it was carried out by soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army. Any honest account of this period requires stating this plainly. The Pacific War that followed Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, extended the conflict Japan was already fighting in China into a confrontation with the United States, Britain, Australia, and the Netherlands simultaneously. The initial Japanese operations extended Japanese control across a vast arc of the Pacific and Southeast Asia, with a speed that briefly suggested the kind of strategic gamble Nobunaga would have recognized. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, the architect of the Pearl Harbor operation, had warned before the war that Japan could run wild for 6 months or a year, but that after that he had no confidence in the outcome. His assessment proved accurate to the month. The Battle of Midway, in June 1942, in which American codebreakers had deciphered enough of Japanese naval communications to position their fleet to ambush the Japanese carrier force, resulted in the loss of 4 Japanese fleet carriers and their experienced air groups in a single engagement. The historian John Keegan, in his study The Second World War, published in 1989, describes Midway as the engagement that definitively shifted the strategic balance of the Pacific War. What followed was 3 years of grinding attrition across the Pacific Islands, each one contested with a ferocity that shocked even veterans of European warfare. The Japanese military and political leadership understood by 1944 that the war was lost in any strategic sense. The question that paralyzed decision-making was what an acceptable end would look like. The ideology that had driven Japan to war, the absolute prohibition on surrender that had been embedded in military culture since the Meiji period, made negotiated peace almost politically impossible to advocate openly. The men who attempted to explore peace options did so knowing they risked assassination. The American firebombing campaign against Japanese cities, which began in earnest in March 1945, with the raid on Tokyo that killed somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 people in a single night, according to various historical estimates, and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th, each killing between 70,000 and 140,000 people in the immediate period following the attacks, with additional deaths from radiation in the months that followed, confronted the Japanese leadership with a form of destruction that the existing ideology had no framework for absorbing. The Soviet Union's declaration of war against Japan on August 8th and the immediate invasion of Manchuria removed the last hope of a negotiated peace through Soviet mediation. On August 15th, 1945, Emperor Hirohito spoke on the radio for the first time in his life. The recording was scratchy. The formal court Japanese he used was difficult for ordinary listeners to understand fully, but the meaning was clear. Japan had surrendered. The ideology that had promised divine protection had delivered atomic fire. The military that had promised Asian liberation had produced continental devastation, and the road that had begun in the ambitions of the Meiji transformation, with all of their genuine courage and genuine achievement, had arrived here, in ashes, in silence, in a country that had lost everything it thought it was. There is a moment that survivors of the surrender broadcast describe again and again in their accounts. Not the moment of hearing the emperor's voice, but the moment after, when the broadcast ended, when the silence came back, when people looked at each other and at the rubble around them and understood, for the first time, that it was over, and that whatever came next would have to be built from nothing. Chapter 11. Ashes and Occupation. The rebuild begins again. On September 2nd, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay, Japanese officials signed the documents of formal surrender. The sky was overcast. The ceremony lasted 23 minutes. General Douglas MacArthur spoke briefly. He spoke of a better world, of freedom, tolerance, and justice. Standing on the deck of an American battleship, surrounded by the naval power that had destroyed the empire, the Japanese delegation signed, and then they went home to a country that was, in the most literal sense, in ruins. The statistics are necessary. 66 major cities had been firebombed. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and dozens of other urban centers had lost between 1/4 and 3/4 of their built area. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were landscapes of fused glass and ash. The merchant marine, which had carried the imports of food and raw materials that a resource-poor island nation required to survive, had been largely sunk by American submarines and aircraft. Agricultural production in 1945 was roughly half its pre-war level. Millions of people were surviving on rations below the caloric minimum required for basic health. The statistics tell you the scale. What they cannot tell you is what it felt like to be a person walking through those streets. A woman in Tokyo who had spent the last months of the war in a factory assembling aircraft parts, who had watched her neighborhood burn in the March firebombing, who had listened to the emperor's voice on the radio and not fully understood the words, but understood the tone, was now walking past the ruins of a city she no longer recognized, trying to find enough to eat, trying to understand what the word surrender meant for the life she was supposed to build from here. The historian John Dower, in his study Embracing Defeat, published in 1999, which won both the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award, and remains the definitive English-language account of occupied Japan, describes the emotional landscape of 1945 Japan as one in which the dominant feelings were exhaustion, grief, and a desperate hunger for some framework that could make sense of what had happened and point toward what came next. The ideology was gone. The god had declared himself human. The divine wind had not come. What remained was the question that every person in Japan was living with in the autumn of 1945. What now? MacArthur's occupation headquarters moved with considerable speed in the first months. The decision not to prosecute Emperor Hirohito as a war criminal was the most politically fraught. MacArthur decided against prosecution for reasons that were primarily practical. His assessment, communicated to Washington, was that prosecuting the emperor would produce massive civil resistance that would require substantially larger occupation forces and might trigger the kind of guerrilla insurgency that would make peaceful transformation impossible. What MacArthur required of Hirohito in exchange for his protection was a public statement that he was not a god. On January 1st, 1946, the emperor issued what is known as the Humanity Declaration, in which he denied the concept that the emperor is divine and that the Japanese people are superior to other races. The symbolic weight of the statement was immediate and real. The god had declared himself human. The ideology that had justified the war had been repudiated by the institution it had centered on. The new constitution, drafted by SCAP legal officers in February 1946, adopted by the Japanese parliament, and coming into effect in May 1947, was an extraordinary document produced under extraordinary circumstances. It retained the emperor as the symbol of the state. explicitly deriving his position from the will of the people. It guaranteed a comprehensive range of civil liberties. And in Article 9, it renounced war as a sovereign right of the nation and prohibited the maintenance of war potential. Article 9 has been debated in Japan from the moment of its adoption to the present. What is clear is that over the following decades, it became, for substantial portions of the Japanese public, not an American imposition, but an authentic expression of Japan's determination never to repeat the catastrophe of the war. The peace constitution became, in ways that nobody in 1947 could have fully predicted, part of Japanese identity itself. The economic reforms of the occupation were as transformative as the constitutional ones. The zaibatsu, the great conglomerate families that had dominated the pre-war and wartime economy, were dissolved. The land reform of 1946 and 47 was one of the most comprehensive redistributions of agricultural land in 20th century history, outside of communist revolutions. Absentee landlords were required to sell their land to the government at fixed prices. And the land was resold to the tenant farmers, who worked it at prices they could afford. The historian Andrew Gordon, in his survey of modern Japanese history, published in 2003, describes the land reform as probably the single most important social change of the occupation period, transforming the social structure of rural Japan in ways that made possible the broad-based prosperity of the subsequent recovery. Then the Korean War began in June of 1950, and the strategic context of the occupation changed completely. The United States needed a stable, economically functional Japan as a strategic base and ally in the Cold War. American military procurement orders for supplies, equipment, and services flooded into the Japanese economy at precisely the moment when Reconstruction was beginning to gain momentum. The war that was devastating Korea was, for Japan, an economic stimulus of enormous scale. Industrial production surged. The supply chains and manufacturing capabilities that the wartime economy had built were being rebuilt and redirected toward civilian and export production. By 1951, when the San Francisco Peace Treaty was signed and the formal occupation ended, Japan was already on a trajectory that the devastation of 1945 had made seem impossible. And here is the thing that the woman walking through the ruins of Tokyo in September 1945 could not have known, could not have imagined, could not have dared to hope. Her children would grow up in one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Her grandchildren would live in a society whose products would be exported to every country on earth, whose technology would set the standard for industries that did not yet exist, whose culture would be consumed by hundreds of millions of people who had never heard of the Tokyo firebombing and had no idea that the world they were living in had been built on the foundation of that silence in August of 1945. The second rebuild had begun, and unlike the first, this one had been built not just by Japanese hands, but by a collaboration, coerced in its origins, but increasingly genuine in its implementation, between Japanese determination and American strategic interest. The ashes were becoming something, and what they were becoming would astonish the world. Chapter 12. The Economic Miracle: How Japan Rebuilt a Nation in Plain Sight. In 1946, a factory worker in Nagoya was assembling trucks from whatever materials the post-war shortage economy could provide, earning wages that barely covered the cost of food. The factory had been partially destroyed by American bombing and rebuilt with salvaged materials. The company had survived the war with its organizational structure intact, but its market, its supply chains, and its strategic direction in complete disarray. The company was Toyota. 20 years later, Toyota was one of the most efficient automobile manufacturers in the world. Its production system, developed through 2 decades of rigorous internal problem-solving by engineers who had the specific motivation of people who cannot afford to waste anything, was being studied by manufacturing companies in the United States and Europe as a model they could not quite figure out how to replicate. 40 years after that factory worker assembled his post-war truck, Toyota's production methods had been adopted in modified forms by manufacturers across every industry on every continent. The system those Nagoya engineers built in the 1950s and 60s, out of the necessity of poverty and the discipline of a specific organizational culture, is today called lean manufacturing. It is one of the most significant contributions to industrial practice in the 20th century. And it came directly from the specific constraints of post-war Japan's recovery. This is not a coincidence. It is the pattern. Japan's economic recovery between 1950 and 1970 was not simply a matter of rebuilding what had been destroyed. It was a matter of building something that had never existed before, in conditions that forced the people doing the building to solve problems with a rigor and creativity that more comfortable circumstances might never have demanded. The term Japanese economic miracle was coined by Western economists and journalists trying to describe aggregate growth rates that their existing frameworks had no ready explanation for. Japanese GDP grew at an average annual rate of roughly 10% through most of the 1960s. According to data compiled by the Japanese Cabinet Office and widely cited in economic analyses, including Takafusa Nakamura's study of the post-war Japanese economy, a rate that, sustained over a decade, doubles an economy in approximately 7 years. By 1968, Japan had the second-largest economy in the world, surpassing West Germany. 23 years after the end of the war, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, known as MITI, played a role in Japan's post-war economic development that has no precise equivalent in any other major capitalist economy. MITI did not issue production quotas or allocate resources through administrative command. What it did was coordinate, guide, and in some cases, finance the development of strategic industries through a combination of targeted credit allocation, protection from foreign competition, facilitation of technology licensing agreements with foreign companies, and the cultivation of consensus among the major corporate players in each sector. The economist Chalmers Johnson, whose study, MITI, and the Japanese Miracle, published in 1982, is the foundational analysis of this system, described Japan as a developmental state, a form of capitalist organization in which the government plays a more active and directional role than in the American or British liberal models, without abandoning market mechanisms. Johnson's framework has been debated and, in some respects, challenged by subsequent scholarship. But the basic observation that Japan's post-war industrial policy represented a distinctive and consequential approach to managing capitalist development is not seriously contested. The Toyota production system, developed primarily by the engineer Taiichi Ohno in collaboration with other Toyota engineers, including Shigeo Shingo, whose contributions are documented by the historian Jeffrey Liker in The Toyota Way, published in 2004, was built on 2 foundational principles. The first was just-in-time production, the elimination of inventory buffers by producing components at exactly the rate they were needed. The second was the principle that any worker on the production line who identified a defect had not just the right, but the obligation to stop the entire line until the problem was understood and corrected. Both principles were were radical departures from the mass production model that American manufacturers had developed. The American model was built on the assumption that inventory buffers and quality inspection at the end of the line were the most efficient ways to manage variability. Ono's insight was that those assumptions were wrong, that variability was better addressed at its source, and that the apparent efficiencies of the American model were concealing enormous waste that a company without the financial cushion to absorb that waste simply could not afford. Necessity was not just the mother of invention. It was the specific pressure that turned the invention into a system rigorous enough to transform global manufacturing practice. W. Edwards Deming, an American statistician whose ideas about statistical quality control had been largely ignored by American manufacturers who faced no serious international competition, found an enthusiastic audience in Japan in the early 1950s. His lectures to Japanese engineers and managers, beginning in 1950, introduced concepts of continuous improvement and statistical process control that Japanese industry absorbed and developed in directions Deming himself acknowledged went beyond what he had originally taught. The Deming Prize, established by the Japanese Union of Scientists and Engineers in 1951 and named in his honor, became the most prestigious quality award in Japanese industry. Deming was celebrated in Japan as a national figure. In the United States, he remained largely unknown until American manufacturers in the late 1970s, confronting Japanese competition they could not match, went looking for explanations and found him. The 1964 Tokyo Olympics were the moment Japan announced its recovery to the world in terms that required no translation. The Shinkansen bullet train opened its first line between Tokyo and Osaka on the 1st of October, 1964, 9 days before the Olympics opening ceremony, running at speeds that no train in the world had matched before, and doing so on a schedule of precision that became its own statement about what Japan had become. The phrase "made in Japan" underwent one of the most remarkable reputational transformations in the history of commerce. In the early 1950s, it was a reliable indicator of low quality. By the early 1970s, it had become a mark of quality assurance, particularly in consumer electronics and automobiles, that American and European manufacturers found themselves unable to match without fundamentally rethinking their own production systems. The broader social conditions that supported the miracle deserve attention because they are part of the story that aggregate growth statistics do not capture. The land reform had created a rural middle class with enough economic stability to support domestic consumption. The educational reforms had produced a workforce with high average literacy and technical training. The social contract of high-growth Japan, in which large companies offered their core employees lifetime employment and seniority-based wages in exchange for loyalty and sustained effort, created conditions of economic security for a substantial portion of the urban workforce that were unprecedented in Japanese history. But the costs and exclusions of this contract were real. Women were systematically channeled into part-time and temporary positions that denied them the lifetime employment benefits available to their male colleagues. The environmental costs of rapid industrialization produced some of the worst industrial pollution disasters of the 20th century, including the mercury poisoning of Minamata Bay, documented by photographers W. Eugene Smith and Aileen Smith in their work published in 1975. The aggregate transformation was nonetheless genuinely extraordinary. The country that had been in ashes in 1945 was, by 1970, one of the wealthiest and most technologically sophisticated societies in the world. The second rebuild had succeeded beyond any expectation that could reasonably have been held in the silence of August 1945. And then, the formula stopped working. Chapter 13. The Bubble, the Lost Decades, and the Quiet Crisis. In the late 1980s, Japanese asset prices reached levels that tell you everything you need to know about what was coming. Land in central Tokyo was selling at prices that made the underlying economics of any possible use of that land completely irrational. The Nikkei stock index, which had stood at around 13,000 in 1985, reached nearly 39,000 at its peak in December 1989. A widely cited statistic of the time, noted in financial press coverage of the era, suggested that the nominal estimated value of land in the Imperial Palace grounds was comparable to vast swaths of American real estate. Though economists then and since have noted that such comparisons were more a symptom of bubble psychology than a meaningful economic measurement. For ordinary families, this did not feel like macroeconomics. It felt like the world had finally, completely, and permanently rewarded Japan for everything it had endured and built. People who had grown up in post-war poverty were now holding property worth amounts their parents could not have imagined. The story of Japan's recovery seemed to have arrived at its triumphant conclusion. It had not arrived at a conclusion. It had arrived at a cliff. The Bank of Japan raised interest rates in 1989 and 1990 to cool the overheating economy. The bubble deflated. And then it collapsed. Between 1990 and 1992, the Nikkei lost more than 60% of its peak value. Land prices fell by amounts that left borrowers holding collateral worth a fraction of the loans it had secured. The banking system was technically insolvent by any honest accounting. The financial institutions that had funded the bubble were holding assets at prices that bore no relationship to their market value, a condition that Japanese accounting conventions and regulatory forbearance allowed them to conceal for most of the following decade. The lost decade, the term that became standard shorthand for the 1990s in Japan, was in fact closer to 2 lost decades. And on, GDP growth averaged less than 1% annually through the 90s. Unemployment rose to levels that, while modest by international comparison, represented a psychological shock to a workforce conditioned to expect lifetime employment security. But the statistics miss the human dimension entirely. Think about what the collapse of the bubble actually meant for a specific person. A man in his late 30s who had joined a major company in the mid-1980s, who had given that company the absolute loyalty the social contract required, who had watched his parents' generation build Japan into the second largest economy in the world and had believed, with complete reasonableness, that the same formula would work for him, who had perhaps borrowed significantly to purchase a small apartment in a Tokyo suburb at bubble-era prices, because every indicator around him said that prices only went up. By 1993, his apartment was worth less than his mortgage. His company, unwilling to lay off permanent employees because the social contract prohibited it, had stopped promoting anyone and begun quietly pressuring middle managers into accepting early retirement that was not quite voluntary. The lifetime employment promise was technically being kept. Everything behind it was dissolving. For ordinary families, this did not feel like a recession. It felt like promises quietly disappearing. The political consequences were immediate and sustained. The Liberal Democratic Party, which had governed Japan almost without interruption since 1955, and whose political identity was inseparable from the economic management of the miracle years, lost its parliamentary majority in 1993 for the first time in nearly 4 decades. The coalition governments that followed were unstable, short-lived, and incapable of implementing the structural reforms that economists identified as necessary to restart growth. Every necessary reform threatened a constituency whose political support the governing parties depended on. The banking system needed to recognize its bad loans honestly, which required either letting insolvent institutions fail or recapitalizing them with public funds, both of which were politically toxic. The labor market needed to become more flexible, which required dismantling the lifetime employment system whose social security function had no adequate replacement. The regulatory barriers protecting inefficient domestic industries needed to be reduced, which threatened the political coalitions the governing parties depended on. The result was a decade of inadequate half measures. Temporary stimulus packages that produced temporary recoveries, followed by renewed stagnation, and the gradual accumulation of a public debt burden that reached and eventually exceeded 100% of GDP. Now consider a different person. A young man or woman graduating from university in 1995 into a job market that had frozen. The cohort that entered the workforce between roughly 1993 and 2005 is known in Japan as the lost generation. Young people who graduated during the worst years of the contraction and found themselves locked out of the permanent employment system that their parents had navigated successfully. Many ended up in irregular employment, part-time work, temporary contracts, with none of the security or benefits of permanent employment, and with very limited prospects of transition into it. You had been told your entire life what the path looked like. Study hard, get into a good university, join a good company, give that company your complete loyalty and effort, and the company would give you security, identity, and a place in the world in return. And then the path ended, not because you had failed to follow it, but because the destination had disappeared. Some withdrew entirely. The hikikomori phenomenon, in which young people refused to leave their rooms for months or years, was estimated by Japanese government surveys to affect hundreds of thousands of people by the early 2000s. The sociologist Tamaki Saito, who wrote one of the first clinical studies of the phenomenon, described it not as a mental illness in the conventional sense, but as a response to the specific pressures of Japanese social and educational expectations in an economic environment that could no longer deliver the outcomes those expectations were premised on. The earthquake that struck the Hanshin region on January 17, 1995, killing more than 6,000 people in Kobe and surrounding areas, exposed a gap between the administrative precision Japan projected to the world and the reality of how its bureaucracies actually functioned under sudden stress. The Shinrikyo sarin gas attack on the Tokyo subway in March of the same year added a dimension of social anxiety that made 1995 feel, to many Japanese people who lived through it, like the year in which everything that had seemed solid revealed itself as fragile. The Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster of March 11, 2011, triggered by the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami that killed nearly 16,000 people in the surrounding region, produced a crisis whose dimensions extended well beyond the immediate casualties. The Fukushima Nuclear Accident Independent Investigation Commission, whose report published in 2012 was notable for the directness of its conclusions, described the disaster as fundamentally man-made rather than simply natural, the result of collusion between the government, the regulators, and TEPCO, the plant operator. Japan had built its post-war identity partly on technological mastery. The revelation that its own technological systems could fail catastrophically through organizational failure struck at something deeper than the specific crisis. The demographic challenge that had been building since the 1970s reached acute proportions in the early 21st century. Japan's birth rate had fallen below the replacement level of 2.1 children per woman by 1974. According to data from Japan's National Institute of Population and Social Security Research, and had continued falling in subsequent decades. Combined with one of the world's longest life expectancies and a historically deep resistance to immigration as a solution, this trajectory meant that Japan's working-age population was shrinking while its elderly population was growing rapidly. The fiscal mathematics of this shift were stark and had been clearly understood by Japanese policymakers for decades. A society in which the ratio of working-age people supporting each retiree is continuously shrinking cannot maintain its pension and healthcare commitments without dramatic economic growth. Substantial immigration. Major increases in workforce participation by women and older workers. Or significant reductions in benefits. All of these options faced political obstacles that successive governments found impossible to fully overcome. What the lost decades and the demographic crisis share, at a deeper level than the economic statistics, is a specific kind of challenge that Japan had never faced before in the modern era. Not an external shock that could be met with collective effort. Not a political system that could be dismantled and rebuilt, but a slow, structural, internally generated pressure whose solution requires changing not just institutions, but the way Japanese society understands the obligations people owe each other. The relationship between men and women, the meaning of work, and the terms under which strangers from other countries might be welcomed into the national community. These are not problems that a Meiji-style transformation can solve. They are problems that require something more patient and more difficult than any of Japan's previous rebuilds demanded. Japan was facing its third great test, and, unlike the first two, this one had no clear enemy, no obvious moment of defeat, no black ships to concentrate the national attention, just the slow pressure of a future that the formulas of the past had not prepared anyone for. Chapter 14. What Japan Taught the World Legacy, Identity, and the Third Rebuild. Here is a test you can run right now. Wherever you are, look at the device you are using to watch this video. Think about how it was designed. Think about what it prioritizes. Thinness, precision, the elimination of everything unnecessary. The sense that every component is exactly where it needs to be and nowhere else. The feeling, when you hold it, that it was made by people who cared about the specific experience of the person holding it. Now consider the possibility that those design values, which feel today like universal principles of good technology, did not emerge from nowhere, that they have a specific cultural genealogy, that the aesthetic philosophy embedded in the objects you use every day was shaped, more than most people realize, by a civilization that spent 1,000 years developing the conviction that the elimination of excess and the perfection of the essential were not just aesthetic preferences, but ethical ones. The Toyota production system is, among other things, a manufacturing philosophy. The tea ceremony is, among other things, a philosophy of attention. The haiku is, among other things, a philosophy of what to leave out. These are not three different things. They are three expressions of the same underlying sensibility, applied to different domains by different people across different centuries, all pointing in the same direction, toward the specific, toward the essential, toward the belief that getting one thing exactly right is worth more than getting 10 things approximately right. This sensibility did not come from nowhere either. It came from the encounter between samurai psychology and Zen practice in the 12th and 13th centuries. From the aesthetic refinement of the Heian court filtered through warrior discipline, from centuries of living in a resource-constrained island environment that rewarded ingenuity and punished waste, it was forged in the specific pressures of Japanese history, and it expressed itself, when the conditions were right, in the specific competitive advantages of Japanese industry. Japan's contributions to how the world thinks and makes and feels extend well beyond manufacturing. Consider Akira Kurosawa. His film, Seven Samurai, released in 1954, tells the story of a village hiring wandering samurai to defend against bandits. It is a Japanese story set in the Japanese past, drawing on everything the Sengoku period produced in terms of the psychology of violence, the economics of power, and the relationships between people of different social classes under extreme pressure. It is also, as George Lucas and Francis Ford Coppola and dozens of other filmmakers have acknowledged directly, one of the foundational texts of modern cinema. Its influence runs through Hollywood action films and westerns and science fiction in ways that most viewers experience without knowing the source. The DNA of the Magnificent Seven, of Star Wars, of countless other films, traces back to a Japanese director working in the ruins of post-war Japan, telling a Japanese story about what it means to fight for something you cannot keep. This is not cultural accident. This is what happens when a civilization that has paid very close attention to the specific textures of human experience and has developed specific forms for expressing what it has observed suddenly becomes visible to the wider world. The world finds in it something it did not know it was looking for. Now consider Studio Ghibli, Hayao Miyazaki's films. From Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind in 1984 through Spirited Away in 2001 and beyond, have been seen by hundreds of millions of people on every continent. They are, on the surface, animated films for children and families. They are also, just beneath that surface, among the most philosophically serious works of popular art produced anywhere in the world in the past half-century. My Neighbor Totoro presents a version of the relationship between humans and the natural world in which the spirit of the forest is neither threatening nor sentimental, but simply present, enormous, and not particularly interested in human drama. It is a Shinto sensibility expressed in animation. Princess Mononoke is about industrialization and the destruction of the natural world and the impossibility of simple moral judgments, set in medieval Japan. And it is more honest about those themes than most films made for adults. Spirited Away is about a child learning to work, to endure, to remember who she is in an environment that wants to make her forget. It won the Academy Award for Best Animated Feature in 2003. It remains the highest-grossing film in Japanese history, and in its specific Japanese cultural DNA, in its bathhouse full of spirits drawn from the same tradition that the Jōmon potters and the Heian poets and the samurai all inhabited. It is as Japanese as anything ever made. The world did not receive these films as foreign artifacts requiring cultural translation. It received them as things it recognized, because the questions they were asking about memory and identity and the relationship between humans and the world they live in are not Japanese questions. They are human questions. Japan had simply developed, over a very long time and through very specific pressures, a distinctive way of asking them. Japan's relationship with its own history remains one of the most genuinely unresolved aspects of its contemporary identity. The question of how to remember the wartime period honestly, in ways that acknowledge the suffering that Japanese military actions caused across Asia without reducing the entire complexity of modern Japanese history to a single catastrophic decade. is one that Japanese society has not collectively resolved, and that continues to generate political conflict both domestically and internationally. The historian Franziska Serafim, in her study, War Memory and Social Politics in Japan, published in 2006, describes Japanese war memory not as a single official narrative, but as a contested field in which different social groups have maintained different and sometimes incompatible accounts of what the war meant and what it requires of the time present. This is not a resolvable question through historical analysis alone. It is a political and ethical question about what societies owe to the people their governments harmed, about whether national identity and national accountability can coexist in the same story. Japan has not yet found a stable answer. The countries whose people bear the consequences of Japanese wartime actions, particularly China and South Korea, will continue to hold Japan to an accounting that Japanese domestic politics makes fully satisfying compliance difficult to achieve. This tension is not simply a diplomatic problem. It is a moral one. And honest engagement with Japan's history requires acknowledging it without pretending what has been resolved. The strategic environment of East Asia in the 21st century has added new dimensions to Japan's identity questions. The rise of China as an economic and military power of the first order, the continuing threat from North Korea, and the specific obligations and constraints of the security alliance with the United States have all placed pressure on the pacifist constitutional framework established in 1947. The debate about Article 9 is not simply a legal or strategic debate. It is a debate about what Japan learned from the catastrophe of the 1930s and 40s, and whether those lessons require permanent constitutional pacifism, or whether the strategic environment has changed enough to require a different response. Japan today is a country of extraordinary complexity, navigating a set of questions that its previous rebuilds did not prepare it for. The third rebuild, if that is what Japan is living through now, looks nothing like the first two. It has no dramatic origin event, no Perry's black ships, no surrender ceremony on the USS Missouri, no single morning when the old system's failure becomes undeniable and the direction of the new one becomes clear. It has instead the slow accumulation of pressures that any honest observer of Japanese society can see clearly, and that no single political decision can resolve: the demographic mathematics, the gender inequalities that suppress both birth rates and economic participation simultaneously, the question of immigration in a society that has built its identity around homogeneity and whose labor shortages are becoming acute, the need to rethink the social contract of work in an economy that can no longer reliably deliver the outcomes that contract promised. These are problems that require Japan to do something harder than any of its previous rebuilds demanded. Not to absorb a new system from outside and make it Japanese. Not to rebuild on the same foundations after destruction, but to change the foundations themselves, from within, while the building is still standing. Whether Japan will navigate this challenge with the same combination of discipline, creativity, and willingness to discard what no longer works that marked its previous transformations is genuinely uncertain. History does not guarantee that a civilization which has rebuilt itself twice will find a way to do it a third time. But here's what the full story of Japan, from the Jōmon potters, to the Heian poets, to the samurai, to the Meiji reformers, to the engineers who refused to accept waste, and the animators who refused to accept that beauty and depth were incompatible, makes unmistakably clear. This is a civilization that pays attention. It paid attention to China in the 6th century and built something distinctly Japanese from what it learned. It paid attention to the West in the 19th century and did the same thing again. It paid attention to the rubble of 1945 and built an economy that transformed global manufacturing practice. In each case, the form of attention was the same: observation without illusion, learning without imitation, the willingness to take what is genuinely useful from the outside world and integrate it with what is genuinely valuable from within. The haiku that Matsuo Basho wrote in 1686 has 17 syllables in Japanese. An old pond. A frog jumps in. The sound of water. The image is complete in itself. It does not explain itself. It does not argue for its own significance. It simply presents the specific moment, the sound that opened the silence, and trusts the listener to feel what that means. A civilization that can produce that kind of attention in a poem can produce it in a factory, in a constitution, in a recovery from devastation, in an animated film that a child in Brazil watches and immediately understands. The frog still jumps. The water still sounds. The pond is older now, and the world around it has changed in ways that the poet could not have imagined. But the capacity for attention that made the poem possible is not exhausted by the poem. It is still there. And if Japan's history teaches anything, it is that the capacity for attention turned toward the specific problem of the specific moment. With the discipline and creativity that this civilization has developed across more than 1,000 years, has been enough before. The only question that history cannot answer, because the answer has not yet been written, is whether it will be enough again. That question belongs not to the past. It belongs to the people navigating it right now. In the cities, in the classrooms, in the factories, in the quiet rooms of a country that has always found a way forward before, and that has never once done it by looking away from what was true. The story is not over. It never was,